Lord of the Rings accomplishes more than a good adventure or an escape in a positive sense, the way Tolkien talks about. Who would not want to escape? The only people who don't want to escape are the guards of prisons. But those who are in prison, of course, they want a way out, and there's nothing wrong with that. This book is more than an adventure, it's more than an escape. It's a reminder of what it means to be storied creatures who must pass on stories so that those things that should have never been forgotten are not lost. And I think that's one of the lines that I love from the film adaptation of the story. And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. As Galadriel says, history becomes legend and legends become myths and the ring gets lost. But the story of the Lord of the Rings reminds us that these things should not be forgotten, and that it is part of our duty and our calling to pass on these good things. The heirs of Elendil do not forget things, Aragorn says, that instead you pass on the stories to your children so that the ring will not be passing out of knowledge and that we will not forget these things. Theoden himself doesn't understand hobbits or does not understand what is happening, because he assumes that it's all stories, that it's all things that we told children. They were careless customs. But what Lord of the Rings shows us is those who are going to actually survive this world, who are going to be able to have power in a strong sense, not in a false power the way that Sauron does, but in a way to resist evil and to cling to hope, are those who know the good stories. They know the history. They know the legends, they know the myths, and they pass them down to one another. And that is the legacy of Lord of the Rings. It keeps emphasizing its nature as a story to be told and to be passed on, and not just to children, but as Tolkien intended, a fairy tale for adults. At the beginning of the story, you get to hear that Sam has been listening to the tales of Frodo, and Ted, one of the barmen, says, those are all children's stories. But Sam reflects, I dare say there's more truth in some of the fireside tales and children's stories than you reckon. Who invented the stories anyway? And so we get to hear that even Sam has this kind of wisdom of the kings of Elendil who know how to hold on to these stories and to realize that there is a source of truth in these stories. In the same way that Chesterton has his Ethics of Elfland, that you learn the truth about things from the fairy stories, or the fantasy that reveals we are princesses and goblins and heroes and kings. This is what the Inklings were always doing, and this is what the Lord of the Rings does best, is to show that all of us have a part in a story, that we are storied creatures, and that we will be legends in the future, and that there will be stories told after us in the same way that there were stories told before us, and then we have a part to play. The greatest instance of this, of course, is when Sam and Frodo are in Mordor. They're in the ultimate darkness. And yet I want to read this whole passage and unpack it for 1 minute, because this is the heart of the Lord of the Rings. Yes, that's so, said Sam. And we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo. Adventures, as I used to call them. I used to think they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull. A kind of sport, as you might say. That's not the way of it with tales that really mattered. The ones that stay in the mind. Folk seem to have been just landed in them usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances like us of turning back. Only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't have known because they'd been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on. And not all to a good end, mind you. At least not what folk inside a story and not outside of it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right. They're not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of story we've fallen into. Sam expresses here a change over the course of the narrative. from a young hobbit who listened to the adventure stories, who thought they were wonderful sport and that you went out looking for experiences and adventures because life was boring. But instead what he discovered is that the stories that have purpose were not about mere experiences, but they were, as we've talked about fulfilling vocations, about the path laid out before you, the quest that you must follow without knowing how it's going to end up. And that those who truly fulfill their vocation are the ones that keep going despite every chance to turn around. They see things through to the end. And by doing so, they do things that are worth remembering, not to be forgotten and not to be lost, whether it ends up good in their favor or not. But the story is teaching us, even as the person living it is becoming heroic. And what sort of tale has Sam and Frodo fallen into? Frodo answers, I don't know, but that's the way of a real tale. Take anyone you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to. You're inextricably middled in your own story, as David Lyle Jeffrey writes. You're in the middle of it, and you don't know how it's going to turn out, and that's why you read stories, because you get to see how things turn out. That's why people read novels. That's why people read Lord of the Rings, to get to see a happy ending, because they're in the middle of their own story and they don't know what's next. And stories like this, of course, give you courage to move towards the happiness. Then, of course, he asks, don't the great tales never end? And what you realize is that in the same way that Bilbo's story, his part ended in the great story, and Frodo's began. And then Frodo's ends, and Sam's begins. And in some ways, what readers get to realize is that the Lord of the Rings was not written just for Sam and for Frodo, but it was written for the reader. That the one who then picks up the story where it left off gets to continue living, not knowing what sort of tale he or she has fallen into, but getting to see it through to the end, knowing ultimately that at least in the Catholic vision of things from which Tolkien was drawing, it is always a happy ending.